All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the Gospel of John. In this recording, we're going to be looking at John chapter 12, verses 12 through 36. And to keep in mind the flow of the story, where we're at in the overall story of John's Gospel as he tells it, we just need to keep in mind that Jesus has returned to the outskirts of Jerusalem. He's in the little town of Bethany that's up towards the top of the Mount of Olives. And in the last scene we saw in the first 11 verses of chapter 12, Jesus has just enjoyed a post-Sabbath dinner on Saturday evening with some of his closest friends. It's a dinner where Mary came and anointed him with nard during the meal, and Jesus actually stood up for her, defended her in the face of criticism from Judas, one of his disciples. Now, in this scene that we're going to look at in this recording, we arrive at the beginning of Passover week. And so it's Sunday, sometime on Sunday, when we arrive here at chapter 12, verse 12. And it's Passover week. And it's not just any Passover week. It is the beginning of the final week, the week that culminates with Jesus' crucifixion. And in the flow of John's gospel, this is the climactic scene in part one. If you recall, part one of John's gospel goes from about 1:19 all the way down through the end of chapter 12, 12:50. And one of the main threads of that section of John's gospel has been the 7 signs. All those different sign miracles that John recorded in order to point us to who Jesus is. He's the Messiah and the Son of God, and to show us that we can have life in his name. That's the way he's going to summarize it at the end of his story. So here in chapter 12, verses 12 and following, in this climactic scene of part one, John actually shows us that this life that's in Jesus, is not just for the Jews only, it's for the whole world. And he shows us that Jesus knows his hour has come. The time for the climactic moment in his ministry has now arrived. The scene opens with what has come to be called the triumphal entry, with Jesus' royal ride into Jerusalem. And John's version of it here is abbreviated. One of the reasons for that may simply be that there's already 3 well-known accounts of this in the other 3 Gospels. And yet this event is so significant to the story of Jesus and to the meaning of his life and mission that John just can't leave it out. And so here we are with John's version of the triumphal entry. It begins like this in verse 12. On the next day, that is the day after the dinner party that was just recorded in verses 1 through 11. So on the next day, when the large crowd that had come to the feast heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. Who's this large crowd? Well, it's all the crowds of pilgrims who have come to Jerusalem for the festival, for the celebration of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And in order to feel the weight and the excitement of this scene, we have to remember that Passover is a freedom festival. That's fundamentally what it is. It celebrates God setting the Israelites free from their Egyptian overlords during the days of Moses in the Exodus. And by this time, in Jesus' day, Messianic fever was running high because they had been under foreign rule for centuries. And there was this longing, this angst, this hope that God would intervene and act, just as he'd promised in the Psalms and in the prophets. And so when you come to a Passover in that kind of climate, with that sort of messianic fervor, and you have this freedom festival, and then there's this great well-known wonder worker like Jesus, man, it is really a moment of high energy, high tension, high excitement. And so they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, and here's what happened, verse 13. They took the branches of the palm trees, and they went out to meet him, shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, indeed the King of Israel. This is actually where the practice of Palm Sunday comes from. It's a Sunday in Jerusalem on this particular day. And in their excitement over Jesus, they cut off palm branches and they wave them as a way to escort him down the slopes of the Mount of Olives, across the Kidron Valley, and up into the city of Jerusalem. And so they're waving their palm branches and they're shouting these words, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Indeed, the King of Israel. Hear that, the King of Israel. That's the kind of excitement that they're expecting. Maybe he's the one. Maybe he's the Messiah. Maybe all our hopes and longings are finally going to become realized in this one, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of Israel. And these words that they shout out come from Psalm 118, verses 25 through 26. And we know from later rabbinic text that Psalm 118 was used as a pilgrim song for Passover and even for some of the other feasts. And so in view of that, in Jesus' day, it's likely that that's the way this psalm had been used as people came to Jerusalem and as they sang their songs, hoping and longing for their freedom. This is on their mind, and it's on their heart as they long for everything that maybe God had promised them for Messiah to bring. And they shout out, Hosanna, which literally means save. But it came to be an expression of praise. It's an exclamation that literally means save, I beg you, but it represents kind of the Jewish cry and confidence in God's deliverance. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Notice that they hail Jesus as the coming king, the king coming in Yahweh's name. So all of this pictures Jesus as the king returning to his city and the crowds giving him a royal welcome. And Jesus, John tells us in verse 14, finding a young donkey, sat upon it. We learn from the other Gospels that Jesus actually had two disciples go and retrieve a donkey in his preparation for this moment. That's how he's coming down the hillside as people are waving the palm branches and greeting him. And so he's sitting on a donkey and riding down it. And John, now looking back from years of serving Jesus, post-resurrection, post-coming of the Spirit, decades of faithfulness to the resurrected Jesus, John, looking back on this moment, knows now what it all actually meant. And so he tells us just how significant this act was. He says, Jesus sat on this donkey as it is written, do not fear, daughter of Zion. Behold, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt. And these words come from Zechariah 9, verse 9. And they reflect how Zechariah describes the Messiah's entrance into Jerusalem. Zechariah 9:9 reads like this, rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, daughter of Zion. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And in its original context in the book of Zechariah, this is actually contrasted with the war horse. The king riding the donkey comes to bring peace and victory, not war. And so this action by Jesus, finding a donkey, riding it down the hill into Jerusalem, this is a strongly symbolic action. And Jesus knows what he's doing. He knows what Zechariah 9:9 promises. We've seen all through the Gospels that he knows who he is. And so in this moment, he is donning the mantle of king and Messiah, riding a donkey into Jerusalem. And he knows it's Passover season. He knows it's a freedom festival, celebrating their liberation from Egypt. He knows the heart's longings of these people and how Passover awakened all sorts of national hopes and dreams for freedom from Rome. He knows how it was associated with the coming of the Messiah. And so Jesus knows all of this. And we have to see Jesus as he sits on this donkey, rides down the hills, sees the crowds coming to him, waving these palm branches and celebrating him. He knows what he's doing, and he knows what it's communicating. But John tells us the disciples, well, they're so lost in the moment, they missed some of these connections at first. Look at verse 16. These things his disciples did not understand at first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things were written of him and that they had done these things for him. And so they just were caught up in the moment. They didn't even really think about the scriptures. They kind of missed some of the connections. But later, post-resurrection, post-exaltation, they all of a sudden started reflecting on what had happened. They're like, we lived that out. We actually were in the midst of fulfilling prophecy and didn't even realize it. And so, verse 17, the people who were with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised from the dead, they continued to testify about him. And for this reason also, the people went out to meet him because they heard that he had performed this sign. And so you got to put all of that together in the flow of John's gospel. Just weeks before he had raised Lazarus from the dead, that had been sort of this culminating climactic sign that had generated a lot of interest in Jesus and even some faith in Jesus by some of the crowds. And so you have those people here, you have people coming out to meet him, and you have Jesus embodying what Zechariah had promised. Here is Jesus' royal ride into Jerusalem. But the Pharisees, verse 19, they didn't appreciate all these things. They were concerned about these things. So the Pharisees said to one another, you see that you are not accomplishing anything. Look, the world has gone after him. And it's important to note the phrase, the whole world has gone after him. That's who King Jesus is actually for. He's for the whole world. And the Pharisees were being hyperbolic. They were expressing their frustration that they've lost control of the situation and just, in their frustration say the whole world's gone after him. But when John writes these words, he sees the irony in their statement because it's actually true. The news about Jesus has spread to the whole world. By the time John writes this, it's gone all throughout the Roman Empire, and he knows now it's for the whole world, it's spread to the whole world. And so in their frustration and their hyperbole, John actually sees the irony. That's actually what's true. And in keeping with that idea then that the whole world has gone after him, John records a story. It's a story that's only found here in John's gospel. And it's a story about some foreigners at the festival at Passover who want to meet Jesus. Look at verse 20. Now, there were some Greeks among those who were going up to worship at the feast. We would assume that these were probably God-fearers, Gentiles, Greeks, who had come to the feast to celebrate it because they, even though they were Gentiles, they had some sort of respect and honor and appreciation for the God of Israel and Jewish worship. So they've traveled to Jerusalem to participate in the festivities. So there they are. And these people, verse 21, came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and were making a request of him, saying, Sir, we want to see Jesus. Now, just a couple little details here. The mention of Philip, who was from Bethsaida. John doesn't need to add that phrase. It's not directly pertinent. So the fact that he throws it in there makes me wonder that if perhaps these Greeks are from up north somewhere. Maybe they have a connection to Bethsaida. Maybe that's how they know Philip. Bethsaida was a small fishing village right at the border of Gentile lands. So it's possible that maybe one of them knew Philip. Philip had worked with him before in the fishing business. Who knows? But they come to Philip, and they want Philip to introduce them to Jesus. Verse 22, Philip came and told Andrew, who's Simon Peter's brother, and Andrew and Philip then came and told Jesus. And just a little literary kind of note on the structure of part 1 of John's gospel. It opens, part 1 does, in 1:19 through 51. And what's fascinating is, in that opening scene to part 1, 2 of the main characters are Andrew and Philip. They're featured there. They've been in the background the whole time. Not much has been made of them in part 1, but they're there featured in the opening to part 1. And here we are wrapping up part 1. And once again, these 2 guys are featured. That kind of help us see how this whole thing is sort of bookended by stories that entail Andrew and Philip. And they come, they tell Jesus that these Greeks want to see Jesus, and John doesn't really tell us what happens when they meet. He doesn't tell us how it all plays out in that interchange. Instead, John just recounts some words of Jesus and a sort of important moment that happens as Jesus is talking with these Greeks. So look at verse 23. But Jesus answered them by saying, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. All throughout John's gospel, up to this point, Jesus has known that his hour has not yet come. And he's actually avoided capture and arrest because of it. But no longer. Now Jesus says the hour has come. And it's described as the hour for him to be glorified. So his death and everything that's going to kind of ensue from his death is the hour of Jesus' glorification. That's important for us to pay attention to. So now we know we've arrived at the hour. It's the appropriate time for Jesus to be handed over for death. And look what Jesus says next, verse 24. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Jesus offers a simple illustration from the very familiar world of agriculture. A wheat grain, a wheat seed, goes into the ground and dies, essentially. It rots, but when it comes back up, it bears many more grains of wheat. And for Jesus, he's saying that's what his hour means, and that's what his hour entails. And these Greeks who have come and want to meet Jesus, they're like a foreshadowing of how great and how large the fruit of Jesus' death will be. That he is going to offer himself like a grain of wheat, and it's going to spread throughout the world, and it's going to draw all people to himself. And his followers, his disciples, have to embody this same approach, this willingness to lay down their life so that more fruit can be born. So look at verse 25. The one who loves his life loses it, and the one who hates his life in this world will keep it to eternal life. Now, we see this same sort of theme and teaching and idea in the other Gospels as well. This is really the first time we see it here in John's Gospel. And what John is saying is, if you love your life in the sense you try to advance your life, preserve your life, protect your life, keep your life, do everything you can to hold on to your life, the net effect of that is that you're actually going to lose it. That's not the way to acquire life. The way to acquire life is here, hates his life in this world. What does he mean by that? Well, what he means is what this world has to offer, the pleasures that it offers, the status that this world offers, the awards, the honors, the accolades of this world, the ambitions and the measuring sticks of what really matters. All of that, he's saying, you have to despise that. You have to despise that. And if you do that, you'll actually keep your true life. And the word life here is actually the word for soul. You'll keep yourself. You'll keep your soul. You'll keep that thing that's the essential part of you. Everything that makes you you. You'll actually find it, gain it, keep it if you despise your life in this world. This is the way of Jesus. He's going to lay down his life, and his followers must do the same. In fact, laying down your life is what it essentially means to follow Jesus, to imitate him. Look at verse 26. If anyone serves me, he must follow me. This is not at all what they were expecting serving the Messiah to mean. They were thinking that when the Messiah came, he would be this great victor. He would conquer the Romans. They would be elevated in power and position and status. But Jesus' path is a path towards the cross. Jesus' path is a self-emptying, self-giving path. And to serve him entails following him where he's going. And he's going to his death. And so if anyone wants to serve him as Messiah, he must follow, imitate the way of Jesus. And Jesus says, and where I'm going, there my servant will be also. And if anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. And so there will be honor. The honor will come at the end of the path of following and imitating Jesus, like joining Jesus on the path of self-emptying, self-giving love. That's the path. And if anyone serves Jesus in this way, eventually, somehow, some way, someday, the Father, God himself, will honor him. Well, then Jesus continues by reflecting on all of this and how he himself thinks and feels about it. He says in verse 27, now my soul has become troubled. And what am I to say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. And when you hear Jesus' reflections on his hour and knowing what his hour entails, it's an hour of dying like a kernel of wheat. Jesus, on one hand, says, my soul's become troubled. It's the word for stirred up, worked up. It refers to apprehension or emotional turmoil or even agitation. Like his soul is worked up and agitated by all this. So that's what you have on one hand. But on the other hand, you have Jesus' resolve. What should I say, Jesus says? Save me from this hour? That's the whole reason I came. So here's what I'm going to say. Father, glorify your name. Jesus knows his mission. He knows why he came. And so with steely resolve, he prays, Father, glorify your name. That's what I want more than anything else. On one hand, I know how hard this is going to be, and I'm worked up, I'm agitated, there's turmoil and trouble within me, and yet, glorify your name, Father. Well, Jesus utters those words in prayer. Then the rest of verse 28 says, a voice came out of heaven saying, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. God, in immediate response to Jesus' words of prayer, assures him, I've already glorified my name through you, Jesus, and the works you've done, the ministry you've carried out, the miracles you performed, I've already glorified my name, and I will glorify it again through you, through your death, through your resurrection, through all that's about to come. I will answer this prayer and glorify your name. And it comes as a voice out of heaven, as a word of reassurance from the Father to the Son. Well, look how the crowd responds to this, verse 29. So the crowd who stood by and heard it were saying that it had thundered. Others were saying, an angel spoke to him. Now, all of that indicates their kind of mixed reaction, indicates that they heard some sound, a great thundering type sound, but they didn't understand any words. The same thing actually happened when Jesus spoke to Paul on the road to Damascus. Paul clearly heard Jesus and heard the words he said to him, but those with him only heard a sound from heaven. You can read that in Acts 22, verse 9. That's what seems to have happened here. God spoke these words to Jesus as an audible sound, and people couldn't make out the words. They just could hear this thunderous sound. And so they're trying to figure out, some said it just thundered. Others said, no, I think an angel spoke to him. Jesus replies in verse 30 and said, this voice has not come for my sake, but for yours. Ultimately, it's for your sake. Even though it's a word of reassurance from the Father to the Son, Jesus says, ultimately, it's for your sake. Then Jesus goes on and says, now judgment is upon this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. That's part of the significance of this hour, of Jesus' time and the culmination of his ministry. Jesus' hour is a way of pronouncing judgment on this world. It's also a means of defeating the devil. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. So Jesus, coming to this culminating moment of his mission and his ministry, is a way of pronouncing judgment on the world and defeating the devil. The idea seems to be that the ruler of this present world order is thrown down. He's cast down. He's no longer in charge. He's been toppled from his high place. He's been kicked off the throne. There's a new king. That's actually the picture that's painted in Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 and following. In the context, it's a picture of Jesus being ascended up to heaven and now being given his throne over all the nations. And there's actually a song that follows all of that, pronouncing how salvation has come because Jesus laid down his life. And it's the same sort of picture that we get here, that this hour, this climactic hour to Jesus' life, is also a way of him taking the throne and taking back charge of this world from the ruler of this world who's being cast down. And Jesus goes on in verse 32 and says, and I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. A couple things to note there. First of all, we need to note the contrast with the preceding. The devil is cast out, like demoted, and Jesus is elevated. He's lifted up. And when that happens, he will draw all people, not just some people, all people, not just Jews, all people. John is really wanting us to see in this climactic scene to part one that the whole world is now under Jesus' authority. He's the king of the whole world, and all people are welcome to come to him. In fact, he's going to draw all people to himself. And verse 32 tells us that his being lifted up is how he's going to draw all people to himself. It's the means by which he'll do it. Now, what does he mean by being lifted up? Well, I suspect there's probably several things intended by that word. In view of the book of Revelation and other writings of the New Testament, I'm quite confident that being lifted up in this context includes Jesus' exaltation and glorification. But John explains that it's also a fitting description of the way he's going to die. Look at verse 33. Now, he was saying this to indicate what kind of death he was going to die, meaning lifted up on a cross. Like, that's where it starts. That's sort of his crowning moment in a certain sense. That's his glorification initially, as he's exalted, he's lifted up. But it's going to go beyond that, because that's just the beginning of this whole sequence of events that's going to take place beginning at the end of this particular week that Jesus is at, and culminating in his ascension back into heaven, being seated at the right hand of Father. And so Jesus is going to die by being lifted up on a cross, and it's a fitting picture of what it means for Jesus to be elevated, exalted, and draw all people to himself. Here, by this kind of lifting up, by this self-sacrificial love, this is going to be the power which softens hearts and awakens people to Jesus and draws people to Jesus by this kind of death. Well, the crowd seems to grasp that Jesus was talking about his death, and that kind of idea, death, does not fit with their preconceived ideas about the Messiah. So they ask a question, verse 34. The crowd then answered him, "We have heard from the law that the Christ, the Messiah, is to remain forever. And how is it that you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is the Son of Man?" They're struggling to grasp all that Jesus means by what he's saying. And they're trying to figure out, what kind of Messiah do you think you are? And certainly death doesn't seem to fit with the powerful, glorious picture of the Son of Man in Daniel 7. And so they're wrestling with this. Like, the Son of Man must be lifted up, but Daniel 7, it seems like an exalted picture, but you're talking about like dying like a grain of wheat, and they can't put it all together. So, verse 35, Jesus said to them, "For a little while longer, the light is among you. Walk while you have the light, so that darkness will not overtake you. Also, the one who walks in the darkness doesn't know where he's going. While you have the light, believe in the light, so that you may become the sons of light." Jesus doesn't really answer their question. In essence, what he says is, look, I'm the light of the world. He's already said that earlier in the gospel. I'm the light of the world, and I'm only going to be around for a little while longer. It would behoove you to actually believe now in me, the light, so that you can become sons of light. That's his appeal. His appeal is for them to believe in him, walk with him, so that they may become sons or children of light. And to be a son of entails having the character of, like Father, like Son. To be a son of light is to be a person of light, characterized by light. To be in the dark is to not know where you're going. It's to not know what life is all about, to not understand how to do life wisely and rightly. But to be a son of light is to be of the light. It's to see clearly. It's to live rightly, because you've entered into the realm where light prevails in the person of Jesus, and you've become identified with that. And now you see, and now you walk properly, and you know what life really is about. And so that's Jesus' final appeal at this moment in the Gospel of John, is to become children of light by walking with Jesus and believing in him. Now, as we wrap up this little scene, just a couple reflections. The first is what we've mentioned several times throughout, the whole world. The Pharisees said this, and John sees it as a bit of irony. Whether they knew it or not, they were right. This was for the whole world, and the whole world is going after Jesus. You have Greeks seeking Jesus. Jesus is going to draw all men to himself. Jesus' hour, this hour of glorification, this culminating moment of his death, burial, resurrection, and exaltation, this is for the whole world. Second reflection that I see here is that following Jesus entails finding our life by losing it. Like the thing that makes us us, the essential part of us, right? We actually keep that, find that by giving it away, by joining Jesus on the path and the way of self-sacrificial, self-giving love. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground, it remains alone. But if it goes into the ground, it sprouts a whole lot more kernels of wheat. So we have to go in the ground. We have to be willing to lay down our life for the sake of others. That's what it means to follow Jesus, and that's how we find real, true, lasting life. And then this whole scene is really revolving around this picture of Jesus as king returning to his city, peaceable and humble, riding on a donkey. Jesus is the peaceable, humble king who lays down his life so that others can know and find life. That's ultimately what this scene and this section of John's gospel is about. That's ultimately at the heart of the message of all of John's gospel. Jesus is our wise, peaceable, humble king. All right, thanks for tuning in to this session of the Listener's Commentary on the Gospel of John. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton to each and every one of you who give to support this ministry and make it possible. God is bearing good fruit all around the world through your generous support. And if you want to join the team of supporters, you can just go to listenerscommentary.com. You can sign up for the Study Hub. That's one great way to support the ministry. Or you can click the Give button. It'll redirect you to a page, my page through World Family Mission, a registered nonprofit, where you can set up a one-time or recurring monthly donation right there as well. All donations given through World Family Mission are tax deductible since it's a nonprofit. Thanks a ton for your support.